Welcome to Blurr, where the echoes of history's most haunting trials come alive. Tonight, we enter a courtroom filled with silence, suspicion, and a story that puzzled minds for years. The trial of Eugene Aram is not just about law and judgment. It is about secrets buried deep in the past, and a man whose calm intellect stood under the harsh light of accusation. As the proceedings unfold, questions rise and tension grows. Listen carefully, because the truth in this trial is anything but simple. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share with friends, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another chilling story from Blurr. Chapter 1. A scholar in a Yorkshire town. Knaresborough in the 1730s and 1740s was a small market town in the West Riding of Yorkshire, a place of modest commerce and ancient history, set on the banks of the River Nid and crowned by the ruins of a medieval castle that looked out over a landscape of limestone gorges and wooded ravines. It was not a place where one expected to find intellectual greatness, and indeed, by the ordinary calculations of provincial English life in the mid-18th century, there was no particular reason to expect it. The town had its tradespeople, its professional men, its small gentry, and its working population, and the ambitions of its inhabitants were generally calibrated to the modest horizons that such a place made available. Eugene Aram was not calibrated to those horizons. He had been born in 1704 in the village of Ramsgill, in the North Riding of Yorkshire, the son of a gardener, and he had received no formal education beyond the most elementary level. What he received instead, through his own restless and extraordinary intelligence, was an education that he constructed almost entirely from his own reading, his own observation, and his own relentless capacity for intellectual labor. By the time he arrived in Knaresborough as a schoolmaster in the 1730s, he had already taught himself Latin and Greek, had begun the study of Hebrew, and had accumulated a knowledge of philology and comparative linguistics that was, for a self-educated man of his background and means, genuinely remarkable. He set up a school in Knaresborough and taught there for a number of years, acquiring a reputation as a man of unusual learning and unusual ability. His pupils came from the better families of the town and surrounding area. He was known and respected, if not universally liked, as a figure of intellectual distinction in a community that had relatively few of them. He read widely, he continued his linguistic studies, and he corresponded with learned men in a way that suggested ambitions that went well beyond the schoolmaster's role in a Yorkshire market town. But Eugene Aram's life was not the straightforward story of a self-made scholar rising by merit. His marriage was unhappy. He had a wife, Anna, and several children, and the domestic arrangements of his household were troubled in ways that the historical record allows us to see only partially and imperfectly. He was a man of complex temperament, capable of the sustained concentration and intellectual discipline that great scholarship demands, but also apparently capable of actions that placed him in very different company from the scholars and philosophers whose work he admired. In February of 1745, a man named Daniel Clark disappeared from Knaresborough. Clark was a shoemaker and flax dresser, a man of no particular distinction, who had recently married and who had, in the weeks before his disappearance, been involved in a series of financial transactions that had left several of Knaresborough's tradespeople significantly out of pocket. He had borrowed money, obtained goods on credit, and accumulated obligations that he had given no sign of intending to honor. And then, one night in February, he was gone. His disappearance did not, at first, generate the kind of investigation that it would later be seen to have warranted. The most obvious initial assumption was that Clark had absconded, that a man who had been systematically defrauding his neighbors had taken the most practical available route to avoid the consequences of his dishonesty and had simply left Knaresborough for somewhere he was not known and could not be pursued. Eugene Aram also left Knaresborough shortly after Clark's disappearance, and made his way to various other parts of England, teaching in several schools over the following years, and continuing his scholarly work wherever he settled. For 13 years, the disappearance of Daniel Clark remained uninvestigated and apparently forgotten. And then, in 1758, a discovery in a limestone cave outside Knaresborough changed everything. Chapter 2. The Bones in St. Robert's Cave. St. Robert's Cave is a natural cavity in the limestone gorge of the River Nid, just outside Knaresborough, named for a 12th century hermit who had reputedly used it as his dwelling place. It was known to the local population, accessible to anyone who cared to make their way down the gorge, and had been a local curiosity and tourist attraction in its modest way for as long as anyone could remember. It was not a place of obvious secrecy, not a location that an intelligent murderer would necessarily have chosen to conceal a body, and yet it was here, in the summer of 1758, that a man digging the cave for limestone discovered human bones. The discovery was made by a man named William Sharp, who had been quarrying for lime in the area of the cave. The bones he found were those of a human skeleton, buried under a few inches of earth within the cave, and their presence raised immediate questions about how they had come to be there and whose bones they were. The local constabulary was informed, the bones were examined, and the question of their origin began to be seriously investigated. The investigation might have proceeded slowly, or might have reached no conclusion, had it not been for one Richard Houseman. Houseman was a flax dresser in Knaresborough, a man who had known both Daniel Clark and Eugene Aram in the years before Clark's disappearance, and who had been, as the investigation would establish, more closely involved in the events of February 1745 than the world had previously known. When Houseman was questioned about the bones found in St. Robert's Cave, his answers were, to say the least, evasive. And when the pressure of the investigation was increased, and when Houseman was made to understand the seriousness of the position in which his evasiveness was placing him, he broke. Houseman's account, given under the threat of prosecution, was this. In February of 1745, he and Eugene Aram had murdered Daniel Clark. The killing had taken place at night, outside the town. Clark had been struck on the head with a weapon. His body had been buried, initially in St. Robert's Cave. Houseman did not claim to have killed Clark himself. He presented himself as a secondary participant, a man who had been present and involved, but who had not struck the fatal blow. He named Aram as the principal killer. He offered his evidence in exchange for immunity from prosecution, an exchange that the authorities were prepared to make in order to secure the evidence they needed to pursue the case. The bones in St. Robert's Cave were examined more carefully in the light of Houseman's account. They were determined to be human, consistent with the physical characteristics of Daniel Clark, as described by those who had known him, and their location was consistent with Houseman's description of where the body had been buried. The case against Eugene Aram was now formally opened, and the man himself, who had been living and working in Lynn in Norfolk as a schoolmaster, was tracked down and arrested in August of 1758. He had been at large, working in schools across England, for 13 years after the murder. His arrest, when it came, was the beginning of a legal proceeding that would be remarkable not primarily for its forensic complexity, but for the extraordinary performance that Eugene Aram would deliver in his own defense. Chapter 3. The Man Who Was Hunted. Eugene Aram's life, in the 13 years between the murder of Daniel Clark and his arrest in 1758, was, on its surface, the life of a man who was doing exactly what his abilities and his ambitions suggested he should be doing. He had moved from Knaresborough to various other parts of England, working as a schoolmaster in different establishments, and he had continued and deepened the scholarly work that was, by this period, developing into something genuinely significant. He had settled in Lynn, in Norfolk, and was working there as an usher, a junior teacher, in a school when the officers arrived to arrest him. His reputation in Lynn was good. He was known as a learned man, a capable teacher, and a person of quiet and scholarly habits. He had been corresponding with some of the leading philologists of his day, and his work on the relationship between the Celtic languages and other ancient European tongues was attracting attention in circles that were, by the standards of science, mid-18th century England, at the cutting edge of what would later become the science of comparative linguistics. The comparison that Aram's case inevitably invites is with other scholars who have combined intellectual distinction with criminal conduct, and the comparison is illuminating precisely because it resists easy resolution. The intellectual work was real. The philological insights were genuine. The letters to learned correspondents were not the productions of a fraud or an impostor, but of a man who had thought deeply and originally about questions that genuinely mattered. And yet, if Haussmann's account was to be believed, and it would in large measure be believed by the jury that heard it, this same man had participated in the violent killing of another human being 13 years earlier, and had lived with that full knowledge through all the years of his scholarship and his teaching. How these two things coexisted in one person is not a question that the law was required to answer, and it is not a question that the historical record provides the material to answer with any completeness. What the record does provide is the evidence of the trial, and most particularly the evidence of Aram's own extraordinary defense, which remains one of the most remarkable pieces of impromptu legal argument ever delivered by a defendant in an English criminal court, and which illuminates more clearly than anything else in the historical record the nature of the man who delivered it. Aram was brought from Lynn to York, where the assizes were to be held, and he was remanded in custody to await trial. The period of his imprisonment was used in part for the preparation of the defense that he would conduct in his own person at the trial. He had no legal training. He had no access to the professional apparatus of the bar. He was a schoolmaster with no experience of criminal proceedings, and with the very considerable disadvantage of being the accused in a capital case. What he had was his intelligence, his learning, his memory, and a lifetime of independent study that had given him the capacity for sustained, disciplined argument. He would use all of it. Chapter 4. The Yorkshire Assizes, 1759. The trial of Eugene Aram took place at York Assizes in August of 1759, before Mr. Justice Noel. The York Assizes were the regular sittings of the Circuit Court that handled the most serious criminal matters in the northern counties of England, and they were significant events in the life of the region, attended by the gentry and the legal community, and reported in the provincial newspapers with an attention that reflected their importance in the administration of justice. The Aram trial was remarkable from its opening moments. The charge was the murder of Daniel Clark, committed in February of 1745, more than 14 years before the trial. The interval between the alleged crime and the prosecution was itself an unusual feature, and it raised questions that the defense would address with considerable force. The principal evidence for the prosecution was the testimony of Richard Haussmann, the co-conspirator who had turned King's evidence, and the physical evidence of the bones found in St. Robert's Cave. The prosecution's case was presented by counsel, whose identity the historical record has not preserved with complete certainty, but whose arguments are substantially recoverable from the accounts of the proceedings that survive. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. Aram, Clark, and Haussmann had conspired in a scheme to defraud the tradespeople of Knaresborough by obtaining goods and money on credit in Clark's name, intending never to repay. When the scheme had run its course and the proceeds were in hand, Aram had murdered Clark, with Haussmann's assistance, or at least presence, in order to eliminate the one person who could expose him as the organizer of the fraud. Clark had been struck down, his body buried in St. Robert's Cave, and Aram had then left Knaresborough with whatever money and goods had been accumulated, leaving his wife and family behind. Haussmann was called to give his evidence. He described the events of the night in February 1745, when Clark had been killed, the location of the killing, and the burial of the body. He described Aram's role as the principal actor in the killing. He was cross-examined, But without the benefit of professional counsel, the cross-examination was limited in its effectiveness, and Houseman maintained the essential outlines of his account. The physical evidence was presented through the testimony of those who had found and examined the bones. The bones had been found in St. Robert's Cave. They were human. They were consistent with being those of an adult male. These facts were established. The connection of the bones to Daniel Clark, however, was something that the evidence could establish only inferentially, and this inferential gap in the prosecution's case was one that Aram's defense would exploit with considerable precision and sophistication. Chapter 5. The Bones and Their Ambiguity. The physical evidence at the center of the prosecution's case was the set of bones found in St. Robert's Cave in 1758, and the question of whose bones they were was, in strict legal terms, far from definitively resolved. The bones had been identified as human. They had been identified as consistent with the physical characteristics of an adult male, but the identification of them specifically as the bones of Daniel Clark, the man whom Aram was accused of murdering, rested entirely on Houseman's testimony and on the inference that a set of human bones found in the location where Houseman said Clark had been buried must therefore be Clark's bones. This inference was, as Aram would argue with considerable force, not an inevitable one. Knaresborough, in the mid-18th century, was a limestone district in which quarrying was common. Caves were plentiful, and the presence of bones, including human bones from ancient burials, was not without precedent. The cave at St. Robert's had been known and accessible for centuries. The bones found there might be the bones of Daniel Clark, and if Houseman's account was accurate, they almost certainly were. But they might also be the bones of any number of other people, whose remains might have been deposited in that place across the many centuries of its known existence. Aram's argument on this point drew on his scholarly knowledge of ancient burial customs, his familiarity with classical texts dealing with the treatment of the dead, and his understanding of the geological and archaeological character of the limestone district in which Knaresborough was situated. He argued in effect that the bones were not necessarily Clark's bones, that their presence in the cave was not conclusive evidence of Clark's murder, and that the jury should not allow Houseman's interested testimony to fill a gap in the physical evidence that the physical evidence itself left genuinely open. This was, in the context of 18th century criminal procedure and its relatively undeveloped forensic practices, a legally sophisticated argument. The identification of bones as those of a specific named individual was not something that the science of the period could establish with any precision. There were no dental records, no DNA analysis, no anthropometric databases that could match a skeleton to a named person. The identification was, necessarily and entirely, a matter of testimony and inference. And testimony from an accomplice who had made a deal for his own immunity was not, even by the standards of the period, testimony of the most reliable kind. The prosecution's response to this argument was to press the point of Houseman's consistency and the corroborating detail of the bones' location, which matched Houseman's account of where the burial had taken place. But the argument Aram was making was not primarily about Houseman's consistency. It was about whether the prosecution had, as the law required, proved its case beyond reasonable doubt, and whether bones that could not be definitively identified as Clark's, found in a place where various human remains might reasonably have been deposited, constituted that proof. It was an argument that a skilled professional advocate might well have pressed more effectively than Aram himself was able to do, constrained as he was by his lack of legal training and his position as the accused. Chapter 6. Richard Houseman and the Problem of the Accomplice. Richard Houseman was the foundation of the prosecution's case, and he was also, as Aram recognized and argued, one of its most significant vulnerabilities. The practice of allowing accomplices to give evidence against their associates in exchange for immunity from prosecution was well established in 18th century English law, but it was also recognized as producing testimony of inherently uncertain reliability. A man who confesses to participation in a crime in exchange for his own freedom, and who then describes the greater guilt of his associate, has the most obvious possible motive for shading his account in ways that minimize his own responsibility, maximize that of the person he is naming. Houseman's situation had several features that made his testimony particularly questionable. He had been involved in the fraud that had preceded Clark's death. He had been present at or near the killing, by his own account. He had known about the disposal of Clark's body for 13 years and had said nothing to anyone. He had come forward only when the bones were discovered and when his own position became untenable. And he had made a deal, explicit or implicit, that secured his own immunity in exchange for his testimony against Aram. Aram pressed each of these points in his defense. He asked the jury to consider what weight they should give to the testimony of a man who was himself an admitted participant in whatever had occurred, who had lived with his knowledge for over a decade without making any disclosure, and who had come forward only under the pressure of circumstances that threatened his own prosecution. He argued that Houseman's account was the account of a man who had every reason to minimize his own role and maximize Aram's, and that the jury should weigh that account with the skepticism that its provenance warranted. He also raised the possibility that Houseman himself had been more deeply involved in Clark's death than his testimony allowed, that the picture of Houseman as a secondary witness to Aram's violence was a self-serving narrative that the truth might not support. This was a dangerous argument to make without evidence, since it could appear to be mere mudslinging at a prosecution witness, but it had a genuine basis in the structure of the evidence. Houseman had been with Aram and Clark. He had known where the body was buried. He had known about the fraud. The specific allocation of responsibility between the two men for Clark's death was something that only Houseman and Aram could know, and the jury was being asked to accept Houseman's version of that allocation on the basis of Houseman's word alone. The problem of accomplice testimony was one that English law recognized and had developed doctrines to address, most notably the principle that a jury should be directed to treat accomplice testimony with caution and to look for corroborating evidence before relying upon it. Whether the jury in Aram's case received adequate direction on this point is something that the surviving record does not allow us to determine with confidence, but the issue was one that Aram himself understood and articulated with clarity in his defense address. Chapter 7. Aram's Defense Speech. Eugene Aram's defense speech, delivered at York Assizes on August 3, 1759, is one of the most celebrated documents in the history of English criminal law. It was not prepared with the assistance of professional counsel. It was not the product of a legal education or of experience in criminal advocacy. It was the work of a self-taught schoolmaster who had read widely in law, in classical history, in philosophy, and in the natural sciences, and who had spent the months of his imprisonment in constructing an argument that he would deliver, in his own person, to the jury that would decide his fate. The speech has been preserved in several versions, the most complete of which was published shortly after the trial, and has been reprinted and discussed many times since. It runs to several thousand words and covers, in a sequence that reflects both careful preparation and genuine intellectual power, the major weaknesses of the prosecution's case. It is, by any fair assessment, an extraordinary piece of work, and the fact that it was ultimately unsuccessful does not diminish its intellectual distinction. Aram began with the bones. He addressed the question of whether the bones found in St. Robert's Cave were necessarily those of Daniel Clark, and he did so with an argument drawn from his own scholarly knowledge of burial practices in ancient Britain. He noted that the limestone district around Knaresborough had been continuously inhabited since very ancient times, that caves and rock shelters in such districts were regularly used as burial places across many centuries, and that the discovery of human bones in such a location was entirely consistent with the area's long history as a place of human settlement and ancient interment. He cited classical and historical sources for the prevalence of cave burials in Britain and elsewhere, and he argued that the bones, whatever their origin, could not without additional evidence be identified as those of any specific individual, still less of Daniel Clark. He then turned to the question of Houseman's testimony. He addressed the jury about the nature of accomplice evidence, about the incentives that shaped the testimony of a man in Houseman's position, and about the danger of accepting as proof the word of a person who had purchased his own immunity by naming another. He spoke of the corroboration that the law ought to require before such testimony could sustain a conviction, and he argued that the physical evidence, the unidentified bones, provided corroboration of Houseman's story only if one already assumed the story to be true, which was precisely the circular reasoning that the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt was designed to prevent. He addressed the lapse of time between the alleged murder and the prosecution, noting that the passage of 14 years made the recollection of events less reliable, that witnesses who had known the circumstances of Clark's disappearance in 1745 might now be dead or unavailable, and that the delay itself was a form of prejudice to his defense that the jury should take into account. He did not make this argument with the confidence of a lawyer who knew the legal doctrine, but he made it with the instinct of an intelligent man who understood that 14 years was a long time and that justice delayed in this fashion imposed particular burdens on the accused. Chapter 8. The motive question. One of the most interesting aspects of Aram's defense was his treatment of the question of motive, which the prosecution had presented in terms of the fraud and the desire to eliminate Clark as a witness and potential informant. Aram challenged this account with some effectiveness, but his challenge also revealed, inadvertently, certain things about the circumstances of 1745 that complicated the picture he was attempting to present. The prosecution's theory was that Aram had been the organizer of the fraud in which Clark had been the instrument, that Clark had obtained goods and money on credit from various tradespeople of Knaresborough in a scheme that Aram had devised, and that Aram had then killed Clark in order to prevent Clark from revealing his role in the scheme when the inevitable accounting came. This theory placed Aram as the intelligent organizer, using Clark as a relatively simple tool, and the murder as the act of a clever man, eliminating the evidence of his cleverness. Aram's response was to deny that he had been involved in the fraud at all, to argue that whatever Clark had done in the weeks before his disappearance had been Clark's own affair, and that the connection the prosecution was drawing between the fraud and the murder was an assumption rather than an established fact. He argued that his departure from Knaresborough after Clark's disappearance was not evidence of guilt, but simply the consequence of the disruption that Clark's activities had caused in the town, and that a man who had done nothing wrong, but who found himself in an environment contaminated by association with a fraudster, might reasonably choose to leave and begin again elsewhere. This argument was not without some plausibility, and it addressed a genuine evidential gap in the prosecution's case. The connection between Aram and the fraud was, in its specifics, not as fully documented as the prosecution's presentation implied. Clark had been the visible face of the deception. Whether Aram had been the organizer or merely an acquaintance and neighbor of Clark's, who had benefited incidentally from the goods and money that Clark had obtained, was something that the evidence of 1759 filtered through 14 years and through 14. The interested testimony of Houseman could not entirely determine, but the argument also had a fundamental weakness that the prosecution pressed effectively. If Aram had had no involvement in the fraud, and no reason to fear Clark's testimony, why had he left Knaresborough so promptly after Clark's disappearance, leaving his wife and children behind? The departure was, on any account, precipitate and unexplained by any innocent motivation that Aram could convincingly articulate. A man with a clear conscience and no connection to either the fraud or the disappearance would not typically abandon his school, his family, and his established position in a community, and take to the road immediately after a neighbor vanished. Chapter 9. The Classical Defense. The most distinctive and most celebrated element of Aram's defense speech was its use of classical learning, and specifically its deployment of examples from ancient history to challenge the evidentiary significance of the bones found in St. Robert's Cave. This portion of the speech drew on Aram's deep knowledge of Greek and Roman antiquity and on his familiarity with the ancient world's burial practices, and it constituted, in its way, one of the earliest uses of what we would now recognize as archaeological or anthropological reasoning in a criminal defense. Aram argued, with considerable detail, and with citations that demonstrated genuine scholarly command of the relevant material, that the discovery of human bones in a limestone cave in Yorkshire was not an anomalous or suspicious event, but an entirely ordinary one in a region with the kind of ancient human occupation that the area around Knaresborough had experienced. He cited examples from classical authors describing the use of caves as burial sites across the ancient world. He referred to the practices of ancient British tribes, drawing on Caesar's accounts of Gaulish burial customs and on other Roman sources, to argue that bones deposited in caves might as easily be those of ancient Britons as of any modern person. He extended the argument with a passage that became perhaps the most quoted section of his entire defense, in which he noted that the field of battle, the churchyard, the common roadside, might all yield human bones to anyone who cared to dig, and that the presence of bones was therefore no more evidence of recent murder than it was evidence of 1,000 other causes of human death spread across uncounted centuries. The argument was that the specific evidentiary leap from bones in a cave to the bones of Daniel Clark specifically was one that the evidence could not sustain, and that the jury should not allow the prosecutor's narrative to supply what the physical evidence could not provide. This portion of the speech impressed contemporaries and has impressed posterity. It demonstrated a quality of mind that was entirely genuine, the capacity to bring broad learning to bear on a specific and immediate problem with a discipline and a precision that professional advocates of much greater training and experience might have envied. Whether it was ultimately convincing to the jury that heard it is a different question. The jury of the period was composed of men of practical rather than scholarly sensibilities, and the elaborate classical parallels that Aram drew, however intellectually impressive, may have struck them as an elaborate form of evasion rather than a genuine answer to the question of Clark's bones. There is also, it must be said, something slightly paradoxical about the use of scholarly learning as a defense in a case where the defendant's very learning was part of what had made him a figure of interest and suspicion. Aram was not a typical defendant in a Yorkshire murder trial. He was a man of exceptional intelligence and wide reading, and the prosecution's implicit case, though it was not stated in these terms, was that the murder of Daniel Clark bore the marks of an intelligent man's planning, a man who understood how to arrange circumstances in ways that would make detection difficult. The very qualities that Aram deployed in his defense were the qualities that might have made him capable of the crime he was defending himself against. Chapter 10. The Judge's Charge and the Verdict. Mr. Justice Noel's charge to the jury in the Aram case was, by the accounts that survive, relatively brief and relatively unfavorable to the defendant. The judge summarized the prosecution's evidence, endorsed the weight that should be given to Houseman's testimony, and directed the jury's attention to the corroborating circumstance of the bones being found where Houseman said they would be. He addressed the defendant's argument about the ancient origin of the bones with less than the seriousness that Aram's scholarly elaboration of the point might have been thought to warrant, treating it as a speculative alternative rather than a genuine challenge to the prosecution's proof. The charge reflected the general judicial posture of the mid-18th century towards serious criminal cases, which was considerably less protective of defendants' rights than later developments in criminal procedure would produce. The direction of the adversarial system of the period was not yet fully developed in the sense that would be familiar to a 21st century lawyer. The judge's function as an impartial umpire between equally matched advocates, which is the ideal of the modern adversarial system, was less clearly defined in a period when judges were more willing to express their own views on the evidence and to direct juries toward conclusions that the judge himself had reached. The jury retired to deliberate and returned with a verdict that, given the direction they had received and the weight of the prosecution's evidence, was not surprising. They found Eugene Aram guilty of the murder of Daniel Clark. The verdict was announced in a courtroom that had followed the proceedings with intense interest, and that received the conclusion with the mixture of satisfaction and relief that major criminal verdicts typically generated in the public mind. Aram received the verdict with a composure that observers noted. He had spent months preparing his defense, had delivered it with a fluency and an intellectual command that had impressed even those who did not find it convincing, and had maintained throughout the trial the bearing of a man who understood what was happening to him, and who had decided to face it with whatever dignity his situation allowed. The verdict did not appear to break that composure, or at least the accounts that survive suggest that his external bearing remained steady in the moments after the jury's announcement. The sentence was death by hanging, with the additional provision that his body be gibbeted after execution, hung in an iron cage at a public location as a warning and a spectacle. This provision, which attached a particular indignity to the punishment and was reserved for cases that the court regarded as especially serious or especially shocking, was a measure of the gravity with which the case had been treated and of the particular disapproval that attached to a man of Aram's learning and social position who had been found to have committed this kind of crime. Chapter 11. The Confession and the Suicide Attempt. Eugene Aram did not immediately proceed to his execution. In the period between his conviction and the scheduled hanging, he made several significant contributions to the historical record of the case and to the public understanding of what had occurred. Most notably, he wrote a memoir or autobiographical account of his life and of the circumstances of Clark's death, a document that was subsequently published and that added a layer of complexity to the case that the trial itself had not fully explored. In this memoir, Aram addressed the question of Clark's death with a candor that he had not displayed during the trial. He acknowledged that he had been involved in Clark's death, though he gave an account of the circumstances that was significantly different from Houseman's version, and that attempted to present his own role in a somewhat less culpable light. He suggested that Clark's death had been more complicated than the prosecution's narrative allowed, that there had been elements of confrontation and provocation that mitigated, in his own estimation, the degree of his guilt for the outcome. The specific details of Aram's confessional account and the ways in which it agreed with or diverged from Houseman's testimony have been analyzed by historians for more than 2.5 centuries, and the analysis has not produced completed agreement about what actually happened in February of 1745. What is clear is that Aram, in his final account of events, acknowledged participation in Clark's death, while maintaining that the full responsibility attributed to him by Houseman and by the jury was not a fair representation of the truth. Whether this was an honest attempt to set the record straight, a last effort to shape his own legacy, or simply the self-serving narrative of a convicted murderer, is a question that the historical record does not resolve. Aram also attempted suicide in prison before his execution, an act that was at the time both practically and symbolically significant. In 18th century England, suicide was a crime as well as a sin, and a prisoner who killed himself before the scheduled execution denied the public the spectacle that was considered an essential part of the punitive function of capital punishment. Aram's attempt was discovered and frustrated before it was complete, and he was kept under closer watch for the remaining days of his life. The attempt speaks to a state of mind that his outward composure had not necessarily revealed, to the presence of despair and perhaps of guilt beneath the scholarly equanimity that he had displayed in court. He was executed on August 6, 1759, at the Tyburn gallows near York, 3 days after the trial's conclusion. His body was subsequently gibbeted at Knaresborough, in the district where Clark had been murdered and where Aram had once been a respected schoolmaster and scholar. The gibbet was a deliberate public statement about the nature and the fate of the man who had been hanged, and its placement in Knaresborough, rather than at a more generalized public location, made it a specific statement addressed to the community that Aram had once inhabited, and that had in various ways continued to think about him in the years of his absence. Chapter 12. The Scholar and the Crime. The question that the Aram case has always generated, and that no final account of it has been able entirely to suppress, is the question of how a man of Eugene Aram's demonstrated intellectual qualities came to commit the crime for which he was convicted. It is a question that operates on several different levels, and the different levels produce different answers or different versions of the same answer. At the most straightforward level, the answer is the one that the prosecution provided. Aram was the organizer of a fraud. Clark was his instrument. When the fraud was complete and Clark had served his purpose, Aram killed him to prevent the one person who could expose his role in the scheme from having the opportunity to do so. On this account, the crime reflects not intellectual failure, but the application of the same calculating intelligence to criminal ends that Aram applied to scholarly ones. The fraud was planned. The murder was planned. The subsequent departure from Knaresborough was planned. The entire enterprise reflected the same capacity for organized, purposeful activity that produced the scholarly work. But this account, while consistent with the prosecution's evidence, does not entirely satisfy. If Aram's intelligence was sufficient to organize the fraud and plan the escape, why was the disposal of Clark's body so inadequate? St. Robert's Cave was a known local landmark, accessible and well remembered by the community. Burying a body there, in a relatively shallow grave that could be disturbed by the first person who happened to dig in the area, was not the act of a careful planner. It was the act of someone who was doing what could be done quickly in the middle of the night, with limited preparation and limited means. The more complex and more interesting account is one that acknowledges the genuine coexistence in Aram of extraordinary intellectual capacity and very ordinary human failure. Intelligent people commit crimes for the same range of reasons that less intelligent people do, out of greed, fear, passion, desperation, or the momentary eclipse of judgment that extreme circumstances can produce. The scholarly brilliance and the criminal act are not necessarily in the relationship of cause and effect, but simply in the relationship of coexistence within the same personality, a personality that contained, as most personalities do, contradictions and capacities that did not always manifest themselves simultaneously. Aram's own account of Clark's death, written in his final days, suggested elements of passion and confrontation that the cold premeditation theory did not easily accommodate. If Clark had become a threat, if the situation in Knaresborough had reached a crisis point, if the killing had been more reactive than planned, then the act fits into a different psychological frame from the calculating murder that the prosecution described. None of this would have made Aram innocent or excused the killing, but it would have made him comprehensible in a way that purely calculating villainy does not easily allow. Chapter 13. Philological Work and its Legacy. The scholarly work that Eugene Aram had been pursuing throughout his adult life, and that he had continued during the years of his concealed guilt and his subsequent imprisonment, deserves consideration independent of the crime that destroyed him. His philological researches, and specifically his investigations into the relationship between the Celtic languages, particularly Welsh, and the classical languages of antiquity and the languages of the East, were, by the standards of his time and afar, his resources. genuinely original and genuinely significant. Aram had argued, in papers that circulated among learned men in the years before his arrest, that Welsh and other Celtic languages contained elements that showed a closer relationship to Hebrew and to other Near Eastern languages than the prevailing scholarly consensus recognized. He had assembled a body of comparative linguistic evidence that he proposed as support for this thesis, and while his specific conclusions have not survived the subsequent development of historical linguistics with their credibility intact, the methodological approach he was taking, the systematic comparison of vocabulary and grammatical structure across geographically separated languages, was an approach that would later, in the hands of better resourced and more formally trained scholars, become the foundation of one of the most important branches of 19th century science. The scholar William Stukeley, one of the most significant antiquaries of the mid-18th century, was among those who had corresponded with Aram and who had expressed interest in his linguistic work. Stukeley's assessment of Aram's abilities was positive, and the correspondence between them stands as evidence of the serious attention that Aram's scholarly work received from at least some of the leading intellectual figures of his day. The fact that this work was being produced by a man who had murdered someone and was living under an assumed respectability that concealed that fact was something that Stukeley and the others could not have known, and that, when it became known, produced precisely the kind of retrospective discomfort that the juxtaposition of intellectual distinction and violent crime always generate. The question of what Aram might have achieved had the events of 1745 not overtaken him is one that the case inevitably raises. He was, by 1758, in his mid-50s, with a body of work already substantially developed, and with the contacts and the reputation that might have led to its full publication and reception. The career that was cut short by the discovery in St. Robert's Cave was not the career of a minor scholar producing minor work. It was, or had the potential to be, the career of a genuinely original and genuinely productive thinker in a field that would be recognized, in the century after his death, as one of the most important in the human sciences. The loss of that potential, measured against the death of Daniel Clark and the destruction of Clark's own life and prospects, is one of the many troubling asymmetries of the Aram case. Clark, as far as the historical record shows, was a man of modest capacities and questionable character, a person whose participation in the fraud of 1745 suggests neither great intelligence nor great virtue. Aram, on any assessment, was a man of exceptional abilities who made choices that destroyed everything he had built and everything he might have built. The relative value of the two lives is not a calculation that justice invites us to make, but the case raises it implicitly, and the implicit raising is itself part of the case's long cultural afterlife. Chapter 14. The Law of Murder in 18th Century England. The trial of Eugene Aram took place in the legal framework of mid-18th century England, a framework that differed in important ways from the modern criminal law and that shaped both the conduct of the proceedings and the possibilities available to both prosecution and defense. Understanding those differences is essential to understanding why the trial took the form it did and why the outcome was as it was. The 18th century law of murder was built around the concept of malice aforethought, the mental element that distinguished murder from the lesser crime of manslaughter. Malice aforethought did not necessarily mean that the killing had been planned in advance, though advanced planning was certainly sufficient evidence of it. It meant, more broadly, that the killing had been carried out with the intent to kill or cause serious bodily harm, without legal justification or provocation of the kind that might reduce the offense to manslaughter. The distinction was legally significant because manslaughter carried a much lesser punishment than murder, which was a capital offense. The procedural law of the period imposed significant disadvantages on defendants in capital cases. A defendant could not give sworn evidence on his own behalf until the Criminal Evidence Act of 1898, which means that Aram could not take the stand in the conventional sense and offer his account under oath. He was permitted to make an unsworn statement, which was the defense address that became famous, but this statement was not subject to cross-examination in the way that sworn testimony would have been. The inability to give sworn evidence was both a protection and a disadvantage, protecting the defendant from cross-examination, but also preventing the defendant from presenting his account with the weight that sworn testimony carried. Professional counsel were permitted to appear for defendants in capital cases, but the rules governing what counsel could do were more restricted than in the modern period. Counsel could address legal points and examine witnesses, but they could not address the jury on the general facts of the case. The defendant himself had to make any closing address. This was the procedural reality that had placed Aram in the position of making his own defense speech, and it was a reality that the subsequent development of criminal procedure in England largely abolished, moving toward a system in which professional advocates played the full role in capital cases that they now play in all serious criminal proceedings. The law of accomplice testimony, which was central to the Aram case, was a developed body of doctrine that recognized the inherent unreliability of evidence from persons who participated in the crime and who were giving their testimony in exchange for immunity. The doctrine required, or at least strongly recommended, that juries be directed to look for corroborating evidence before convicting on the basis of accomplice testimony alone. Whether this direction was given in Aram's case, and whether the identification of the bones as Clark's constituted adequate corroboration of Houseman's account, were questions that the case raised with a sharpness that the subsequent legal literature has repeatedly engaged with. Chapter 15. The Romantic Afterlife. Eugene Aram died on the gallows in August of 1759. His body subsequently displayed in an iron cage at Knaresborough, and the story of his life and trial might, under ordinary circumstances, have faded into the general historical record of 18th-century criminal justice. It did not fade. Instead, it became one of the most frequently revisited cases in the cultural history of English crime, generating a stream of literary treatments across more than a century that transformed the historical Aram into a figure of romantic myth and gave his case a cultural resonance far exceeding anything that the legal record alone could explain. The literary rehabilitation of Aram's reputation, or at least the literary fascination with the coexistence in one person of scholarly genius and violent crime, began relatively soon after his death and gathered momentum through the early 19th century as the Romantic movement discovered in Aram's story exactly the kind of material it found most compelling. Here was a man of exceptional intellectual gifts, a self-made scholar who had educated himself out of poverty and obscurity, and had reached, through sheer force of intelligence and determination, a position of genuine distinction. And here was a man who had committed a violent crime, who had lived with that crime for many years beneath the surface of a respectable scholarly life, and who had ultimately been brought to the scaffold, not by any failure of his own intelligence, but by the chance discovery of bones in a limestone cave. Thomas Hood's poem, The Dream of Eugene Aram, published in 1831, is perhaps the most enduring of the literary treatments, and it established the terms in which subsequent generations would most commonly encounter the story. Hood's poem presents Aram as a figure of psychological complexity, a man haunted by his crime in the private world of his consciousness, while maintaining the outward function and the outward composure of the dedicated scholar and schoolteacher. The dream of the title is a dream in which Aram, telling the story of a murder to a young pupil, becomes gradually and horribly aware that he is describing his own crime to someone who is innocent of the kind of knowledge he carries. Hood's poem is not primarily a work of historical accuracy. It takes significant liberties with the facts of the case and presents Aram's psychology in terms that reflect the romantic preoccupations of the 1830s, rather than the realities of the 1750s. But it captures something true about the structure of the story, the long concealment, the professional respectability, the sudden exposure, and the psychological burden of guilt carried through the years of a productive intellectual life that has made it a lasting contribution to the literary treatment of the Aram case. Edward Bulwer Lytton's novel Eugene Aram, published in 1832, extended the literary treatment into a full-length fictional work that took even greater liberties with the historical record, but that was enormously popular in its day, and that introduced the story to a vast reading public that would not have encountered it through Hood's poem alone. Bulwer Lytton's Aram is a fully romantic hero, a man of deep learning and noble impulses who is drawn into crime by circumstances that are, in the novel's account, considerably more sympathetic than the historical facts allow. The success of the novel reflects the appetite of the early Victorian reading public for exactly this kind of story: the fallen genius, the hidden crime, the long disguise, and the inevitable exposure. Chapter 16. The question of guilt. The question of whether the historical verdict in the Aram case was correct has been debated, with varying degrees of intensity, from the 18th century to the present. The broad consensus among historians who have examined the evidence carefully is that Aram was probably guilty of participating in Clark's death, that Houseman's account was substantially accurate in its outlines, even if self-serving in some of its details, and that the verdict of guilty was not a miscarriage of justice, in the sense of being the conviction of an innocent man. But the consensus is not unanimous, and the dissenting voices have made points that deserve serious consideration. The evidence against Aram was, at its foundation, the testimony of an accomplice who had bought his own freedom with his testimony, and who had every reason to minimize his own role in whatever had occurred. The physical evidence of the bones was, as Aram himself argued, ambiguous to a degree that the trial did not adequately acknowledge. The long lapse of time between the alleged crime and the prosecution made the defense of the accused genuinely more difficult in ways that the law of the period had no adequate mechanism to address. The possibility that Houseman bore greater responsibility for Clark's death than his testimony admitted, and that Aram's role was more limited or more reactive than the prosecution's account suggested, has been raised by various commentators and cannot be entirely dismissed. The fraud in which Clark had been involved was a collaborative enterprise, and the specific circumstances of Clark's death, which took place in the context of that fraudulent enterprise coming to its inevitable end, were circumstances in which Houseman had as much at stake as Aram. The allocation of primary responsibility between two men who were both present at a killing is not something that can be determined with confidence on the basis of the surviving evidence, particularly when the only direct account is that of one of the two men involved. There is also the question of provocation and intention. Aram's own account of the events of February 1745, written in his final days, suggested that Clark's death had not been the cold, premeditated act of calculation that the prosecution described. If there was a violent confrontation, if Clark had threatened Aram or made demands that Aram felt unable to meet by any other means, if the killing had been more reactive than planned, these circumstances would not have excused the killing under the theory law of 1759 or of any other period, but they would have changed its character in ways that matter both morally and historically. The honest conclusion is that we do not know exactly what happened in Knaresborough in February of 1745. We know that Daniel Clark died, that his death was violent, that Eugene Aram and Richard Houseman were both connected to the circumstances of that death, and that Aram was convicted of murder on the basis of Houseman's testimony corroborated by the discovery of bones at the location Houseman described. We do not know, and cannot know, the precise allocation of responsibility between the two men or the precise nature and circumstances of the killing. The verdict of history like the verdict of the York jury, rests on evidence that is sufficient to sustain a conclusion, but not sufficient to eliminate all reasonable doubt about every detail of what occurred. Chapter 17. The Self-Educated Man and the Law. One of the most compelling dimensions of the Aram case is what it reveals about the position of the self-educated man in 18th century English society, and more specifically, about the position of such a man in relation to a legal system that was designed by and for the educated professional classes. Aram had educated himself to a level of genuine distinction. His knowledge of languages, ancient and modern, his familiarity with classical texts, his capacity for systematic comparative analysis. These were not the superficial accomplishments of an autodidact who had read widely without depth. They were the products of sustained intellectual labor of exactly the kind that produced genuine scholarship, and they had been recognized as such by learned men who had no reason to flatter him. But the legal system into which he was thrust by his arrest was not a system designed to make use of his particular strengths. The 18th century criminal trial was a practical rather than an intellectual exercise. The jury was composed of men of the property-owning classes who had no particular interest in or appreciation of philological arguments about the antiquity of human bones in limestone caves. The judge was a professional lawyer whose framework for evaluating evidence was legal rather than historical or anthropological, and the structure of the proceedings, which placed the defendant in the position of making an unsworn address to the jury without the benefit of professional advocacy, was a structure that rewarded the skills of the trained advocate rather than those of the independent scholar. Aram's defense speech was, by scholarly standards, a remarkable performance. It was, by legal advocacy standards, less clearly so. The arguments he made were intellectually serious, and some of them were legally sophisticated in ways that surprised observers who had not expected so polished a performance from an untrained defendant. But the qualities that made the speech impressive as a piece of independent thought, its scholarly breadth, its use of ancient parallels, its digressive richness, were not necessarily the qualities that made for the most effective advocacy in a criminal trial. An effective advocate focuses narrowly, presses specific points of evidence, and builds a case that the jury can follow through a simple and clear, logical structure. Aram's speech was broader and more discursive than that, reflecting the habits of a man accustomed to academic argument rather than forensic combat. The irony is that his scholarly qualities, which had sustained him for years, and which had made him, in the estimation of some of the best minds of his day, a person of genuine intellectual distinction, were precisely the qualities that made his defense less effective than a skilled professional advocate might have made it. The law rewarded a different set of skills from those that scholarship rewarded, and the gap between those two sets of skills was, in Aram's case, ultimately fatal. Chapter 18. The Broader Legacy. The trial of Eugene Aram left a legacy that operated on several different levels, from the immediate and practical to the long-term and cultural. At the immediate and practical level, the case contributed to the developing law and practice of criminal evidence in England, particularly in relation to accomplice testimony and the standard of corroboration required before such testimony could sustain a capital conviction. The concerns that Aram had raised in his defense speech about the dangers of convicting on the basis of an accomplice's evidence were not in themselves new. The legal doctrine recognizing those dangers already existed, but the Aram case gave those concerns a public and high-profile illustration that contributed to their development and articulation in the subsequent case law. D. The question of whether the identification of the bones as Clark's provided adequate corroboration of Houseman's testimony, given the inability to establish that identification directly and independently, was one that later cases in the law of accomplice evidence would engage with more formally and more systematically than the Aram trial had been able to do. The case also contributed, more diffusely, to the ongoing debate about the position of the self-educated and the intellectually distinguished in English society. Aram's story was, among other things, a story about a man who had transcended his origins through sheer intellectual force, and who had, in doing so, created a situation of instability that the crime and the trial brought to catastrophic resolution. The self-made scholar, who could not sustain the demands of the life he had constructed through his own efforts, was a figure that Victorian culture found both compelling and troubling, and the literary treatments of the Aram story engaged with that figure across several decades. The case raised questions about the relationship between intellectual achievement and moral character that Victorian culture was particularly anxious about, partly because the century was producing so many examples of self-educated men of distinction, who had risen from humble origins and who were now occupying positions that had previously been reserved for the gentry and the established professional classes. The question of whether intelligence guaranteed virtue, of whether the kind of person who could educate himself to scholarly distinction was also the kind of person who could be trusted with the responsibilities of a respectable life, was not a question that the Aram case answered, but it was one that the case raised with unusual sharpness. Chapter 19. The Crime, the Courts, and the Community. The impact of the Aram case on the community of Knaresborough itself, and on the broader communities in which he had lived and worked, is an aspect of the story that is often overlooked in accounts that focus on the legal and literary dimensions of the case. But the human consequences of the crime, the trial, and the execution extended far beyond the proceedings at York Assizes and the subsequent cultural treatments, and they deserve some attention. Knaresborough in the late 1750s and 1760s was a small community in which the murder of Daniel Clark and the subsequent revelation of Aram's guilt were events of immediate and personal significance to many of its inhabitants. Those who had known Clark, those who had been defrauded in the scheme of 1745, those who had known Aram as a schoolmaster and had trusted their children to his teaching, these were people for whom the events were not merely historically interesting, but personally significant in ways that the distance of time makes difficult to fully appreciate. The tradespeople of Knaresborough, who had been defrauded in Clark's scheme, and whose losses had never been made good, had spent 14 years with no resolution of what had happened to either their money or to Clark himself. The discovery of the bones, Houseman's confession, and Aram's trial brought a form of closure, though not the financial restitution that would have been most practically useful. The community had been left in 1745 with the knowledge that it had been systematically deceived and with no explanation of where Clark had gone or whether justice would ever be done. The trial of 1759 provided the explanation and the justice, after a fashion, though the long delay had its own costs. Aram's wife, Anna, and his children had been abandoned in Knaresborough when he fled after Clark's death. Their situation in the years following his departure can be imagined, but not fully documented from the surviving record. A wife and children left without support or explanation by a man who had simply disappeared carried a burden of uncertainty and social stigma that the law did not address and that no subsequent event entirely lifted. When Aram was eventually arrested, tried, and executed, the clarity of what he had done provided a kind of resolution, but not one that made their situation in the intervening years less painful or that restored what they had lost. The gibbeting of Aram's body at Knaresborough, the display of his remains in an iron cage at the scene of his crime, was an act directed at the community as well as at the individual. It was a statement about what happened to men who committed such crimes, and its placement at Knaresborough specifically was a claim by the law that justice had been done and seen to be done in the specific community where the injustice had occurred. Whether the community found this satisfying, whether the spectacle of the gibbeted body provided the closure and the reassurance that it was intended to provide, is something that the historical record does not allow us to determine with any confidence. Chapter 20. What the case of Eugene Aram means. Eugene Aram was hanged at York on August 6, 1759. His body was gibbeted at Knaresborough. His bones were eventually removed from the gibbet. By what process and at what time the record does not clearly establish, and dispersed into the general obscurity of unmarked remains. The philological work to which he had devoted so much of his adult life was eventually published in a posthumous edition and received a mixed reception from the scholars who evaluated it, some finding in it genuine originality and others finding its conclusions undermined by the methodological limitations of an autodidact working without adequate access to the tools and resources of formal scholarship. The novel that Bulwer Lytton wrote about him made him famous to a generation that knew almost nothing about the historical reality of his case. Thomas Hood's poem made him a figure of enduring literary significance, and the trial itself, with its extraordinary defense speech and its unresolved questions, remained in the consciousness of those who studied the history of English criminal law as one of the most remarkable legal performances of the 18th century. What does the case mean, considered in its entirety? It means several things, and they are not all comfortably compatible with each other. It means that intelligence is not virtue, and that the capacity for sustained intellectual labor of the highest quality can coexist, in the same person, with the capacity for violent crime. This is not a comfortable conclusion. We prefer to believe that the qualities of mind that produce great scholarship are incompatible with the impulses that produce violent crime. The Aram case is one of several historical examples that challenge this preference, and the challenge is a genuine one, because the coexistence of the two things in one person forces us to think more carefully about the relationship between intelligence, education, and moral character than we are typically inclined to do. It means that the legal system, in every period, reflects the social assumptions and the evidentiary limitations of its time, and that cases judged by the standards of one period may look different when examined by the standards of a later one. The reliance on Houseman's accomplice testimony, the limited weight given to Aram's argument about the bones, the procedural disadvantages under which he labored without professional counsel, able to address the jury. These were all features of a legal system that would, over the following century, be substantially reformed in ways that would have made Aram's trial look rather different. Whether those reforms would have changed the outcome is a question that cannot be answered, but that the case itself raises with a persistence that no amount of historical distance has reduced. It means that the relationship between crime and culture is complicated, and that the cultural memory of a crime does not simply reflect the legal verdict, but creates, alongside it, a parallel and often conflicting account that serves different purposes and draws on different evidence. The literary Aram, the romantic hero of Hood's poem and Bulwer Lytton's novel, is not the historical Aram, and the cultural fascination that the literary Aram generated was in large part a response to the particular anxieties of the early Victorian period about intelligence, education, class, and the relationship between intellectual distinction and social acceptability. The historical Aram was the occasion for that cultural response, but he was not its subject in any straightforward sense. And it means, finally, that the cases that persist in historical and cultural memory are not always the cases that most clearly illustrate the proper functioning of the law or the reliable operation of the institutions of justice. They are sometimes the cases that reveal the limits of those institutions, the gaps and the failures, and the irreducible uncertainties that a system designed for practical purposes leaves exposed when it encounters facts that resist the clean resolution that practical systems require. The Aram case is a case of this kind. It reveals the limits of 18th century forensic capability, the dangers of accomplice testimony, the procedural disadvantages of the unrepresented defendant, and the long gap between what the law can prove and what the truth may actually be. These revelations have not lost their relevance. The specific forms in which they manifest have changed with the development of the law and the improvement of forensic science. But the underlying questions about proof, about reliability, about the relationship between what the evidence establishes and what actually occurred, are questions that the criminal law has been asking and imperfectly answering since long before. Eugene Aram stood in the dock at York Assizes and delivered a defense that was, in its way, both brilliant and insufficient. Knaresborough still stands on the banks of the Nit. St. Robert's Cave can still be visited by those who make their way down to the gorge. The castle ruins still look out over the limestone landscape that Aram knew as a schoolmaster and that the gibbet once commanded as a warning. And the question that the bones in the cave posed, and that the trial in York attempted to answer, and that 2.5 centuries of literary and historical attention have continued to turn over and examine, remains, in its essential character, the question that all the great unsolved and partially solved cases of legal history pose in one form or another: what really happened, and are we certain enough of the answer to have done what was done in its name? This has been the story of Eugene Aram, of Daniel Clark, of Richard Houseman, and of a trial that placed an extraordinary man in an extraordinary position and produced a verdict whose justice has been debated ever since. Thank you for listening.